Welcome again to the 615DAS subject. So it's all about the design and configure desktop virtualization infrastructure. Today we're going to move on to the build the Horizon environment, and this is going to be over 2 sessions because the actual literal amount of installation and virtual machine work we need to get just to build the lab environment and make sure it's actually functioning is going to take a long time. So last week we covered what are the remote desktop solutions, and we mentioned that there's many various cloud versions of the desktop virtualization solution, and obviously that is the main provider these days. But we also talked about how what we're going to build in this subject is the private cloud version of it. Okay, so there's always that possibility of having a private cloud and doing your own virtualization infrastructure that hosts the desktops, and that's what we're focusing on. Obviously, it can lead to hybrid and eventually the full public cloud deployment. But for this subject, the scope of this subject is to look at that private cloud deployment of the virtual desktop for the workplace. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that we're not going to look at what's delivered in the public cloud at all. Okay, we mentioned it as a solution and something to look forward to in the future, as well as for you to investigate as possibly as a future improvement for the assignment that we're going to talk about in the future. So the product we've chosen is the VMware Horizon, which is something that we should be familiar with in the sense that we are familiar with the VMware vSphere, which the Horizon takes advantage of. Okay, it sits on top of that virtualization infrastructure that's provided by the vSphere, which includes the vCenter, the ESXi servers, and the shared storage, as well as the virtual networking and all of those things we did in our previous subject. So this lesson, there's a short PowerPoint. Okay, it's basically telling you a bit about what we're going to install, why we're going to install it, what the functions are, the requirements, and basically then we get into the worksheet. Okay, there's a link here for setting up the MS SQL Express for Horizon, and that's something for you to reference, to look at if you run into troubles on your personal machine. There's also a couple of links I'll put in later, which actually has the issue with the VMware on Windows 11. Okay, so obviously in the TAFE environment, what we've got is Windows 10 still, and we're going to be upgrading Windows 11 next year. But for obviously your home computer, there is some issues with Windows 11 and specifically the Hyper-V, which means that our nested virtualization may not work properly. So if you've got Hyper-V on your home computer or the computer you're using to do this course, you need to uninstall it basically. So I put the links in this other subject, which you might be familiar with from something you've done before, but basically I'll get those links now. So I'll grab this and I'll put that wrong way. I'll put that same link in our topic. Okay, so again, building the environment, we're going to add a extra link. And this basically tells you how to fix the issues. Okay, so fix, it's basically this. So basically you're going to get an error to say that because obviously our ESXi servers, we've configured it so to enable nested virtualization, and to be honest, that's the only way we can teach this properly without you having to install your own physical hardware. But as a result, it cannot really share your host computer, which is your physical computer, with Hyper-V. And if you do have Hyper-V installed, you need to take it off, which we mentioned. And I'll move this up to be the top link right here. And we'll click on it, which we have here anyway. So we'll go back here, and basically there's a couple of things. Okay, obviously some of these things you would have already checked, including that you've got Intel. So this is the error message first of all that you'll get if you have Windows 11 and you haven't, and if you're getting this message, then there's a couple of things you've got to check. Okay, first of all, so this is the secondary error message if you try to continue without it. So the first thing you have to check is that you've enabled Intel VT or AMD VI on your BIOS. Okay, and obviously without going to your BIOS, you can check by opening your task manager, selecting on your CPU, and you can see that the virtualization is enabled on this computer on mine. Obviously, same for yours. It might look a little bit different because it's Windows 11 versus our Windows 10 here, but you'll see that the virtualization is enabled, which basically means that your Intel VT or your AMD V is enabled in the BIOS. Okay, so that's step one. Step two is, so this is what it's talking about. Step two, Windows 11, you can look at that as well. So that's a good point. So let's go to System Info. And if we look at your virtualization right here, if you see what's a hypervisor has been detected, and obviously that means we've got our VMware workstation. That's the hypervisor it's detecting. Hopefully that's the only hypervisor it's detecting. But under processor as well, so under processor as well, you can see that's the type of processor. And let's expand this a little bit. Okay, so that's not showing me the same as what's on Windows 11. You can, yeah, sorry. This is just checking if your processor supports Intel VT. And you basically can go to this website, which is a search. Okay, so you can search for the processor you've got. In our case here, it's i7 13700. Okay, 13700. That means it's a 13th generation. 13700. Okay, and there we go, the Intel processor, and you can see basically with this, if we go to specifications, I think right down towards the bottom, here, if you look at this, this is all the stuff that you need to make sure your CPU is okay. So the extended page tables, which was that EPT error we were talking about before. So obviously, if you have an i5 or better, you'll more than likely have this ability, but double check anyway. Beyond that, there's also, yeah, so that's for the AMD. You need to make sure you disable Hyper-V virtualization, and also you need to disable the virtualization platform. So this is, again, is my Windows 10 computer. So you go to turn Windows features off, you make sure that Hyper-V is not ticked or is not there at all, and you make sure that the virtual machine platform is also not ticked, okay? And obviously that removes Hyper-V from causing a conflict. You can also use that to get to the same place. That's telling you to check all those kind of stuff. And obviously that requires a reboot. The other thing that was a little bit more is disable, this is probably a more Windows 11 specific. This is what's called a memory integrity in Windows 11. And basically what you need to do is you need to go to the core isolation. So I don't think I'll have it. Oh, yes, I do. Core isolation, but unfortunately I don't have it because this is Windows 10. But what you need to do is go to your Windows 11 in the system settings, you need to turn it off. Okay, it should say yes, and that's gonna cause you not to be able to do run your nested virtualization. So you need to make sure this core isolation is turned off as well. So if you're having any of those errors, okay, first of all, go through this website, check those things I've demonstrated. So this error leading to this other error. Work through this instructions in this website, check all those things off, and fix it for yourself. Okay, but at the end of the day, this subject, the actual practical elements of this subject is very resource intensive. Okay, so we've spoken about that last week, but let's get into what we're talking about today. So today is a short PowerPoint, and we'll move on very quickly because the worksheet is very long. So you can see that's part one, because as I was writing this worksheet, I realized that this is too much for one lesson. And to expect you to do it all at home is not reasonable in an overview of one lesson. So let's click on it, and I'll show you what we have to do. So you'll see that I'll click OK to that. You see that there is a number of things you need to get hold of before you can even start this. Okay, so the virtual machines that's going to be on your L drive is going to be on your L drive or in the IT Studies NAS, and it's going to be close to 250 gigs. Okay, so that's a lot to download from home, especially from our IT Studies NAS. It's not the best. It's not saying it's the worst either, but it's going to take a long time. So if you're watching this video of this unit of this session, you might want to start downloading it and basically do it the next day if you're downloading it from home. But if you're on TAFE campus, it's going to be a lot faster, obviously. So if you can get yourself to a TAFE campus with a portable SSD or even just a USB drive, that you can copy and take it home. So that will be a lot faster downloading from our IT Studies NAS online. But just so you know how to download your access to IT Studies from home, if you go to My Courses, you should have access to our IT Studies home learn site. And from here, there's a whole heap of information. You might have come here for the CRNs and so forth. But one of these, so another good place is that Software for Students, which gives you access to Microsoft software and gives you instructions on how to access your VMware software. So let's just quickly take a side quest here and have a look at that. So if we look at the Microsoft Store, I'm sure you've seen this before. You go to this Azure for Education, you log in with your TAFE SA credentials, you go to Software Resources, and then you can find all your software that you can get, which is not Office, obviously. That's different licensing, but you can get access. You can get Visual Studio, you can get Microsoft Server, you can get Microsoft Windows 10, 11, and all with a license key. So if you click View Key, you'll see the key, and if you click Download, you'll download the installable or the ISO image. Besides that, it also gives you instructions to get your VMware for personal use. So as you know, Broadcom has bought out VMware and now is offering the VMware Workstation Pro for personal use, but it's a bit tricky. You need to go to this website. You need to make sure you register for an account. You need to go to downloads, and you need to select, very tricky, you need to select the version that says personal use. And then you need to download this version. If you download that version, it may not have the licensing for personal use. Once you download it, you install it, all that kind of stuff, you download it, you install it, it will basically say it's a trial, but it will still work. So that's a good thing. So even though it will say it's trial, a bit like how my VMware Workstation right now says it's a trial, let's look about VMware Workstation. It says it's an evaluation, so it's going to say that. But mine, because we put in our own license key, it's going to expire at the end of next year. Not end of next year, May next year. So yours will say evaluation, but there will be no end date. And more critically, your virtual machines will work, which means you can turn them on. If you can't turn them on, that means your VMware Workstation Pro is not the right version. All right, let's get back to the real reason, the IT Studies NAS. If you are going to download the files from our L drive or IT Studies NAS, there's this link here. If you click on that, it will will take you to our web interface. The login's a little bit different. You need to type in your TAFE / that means the TAFE domain / then your username. Your username is not your email address in this case. Your username is literally the username on Active Directory, which is your student ID. So your student ID goes here instead of mine's. Obviously, I don't have the student ID, but then your password is the same. Okay, what happened there? Let's reload that, and we'll log in. So I've saved my credentials. Once you log in, then it will actually be a website. It's a bit slow. Okay, you've got to accept that. So we're not a multinational corporate company, and this is not for all of TAFE. This is purely for the students at TAFE SA who need to download, who study IT studies and need to download larger files. So most students in TAFE SA would never even use this. It will be probably only the system admin students and the networking students who access this. And basically from here, you can go to the L drive. So you can see it's a bit slow loading up. You can go to the L drive in a second. So we might come back to this while it's loading. But it's a slow process of downloading. Just so I can show you where it is on the actual L drive. It's actually, so there's a whole bunch of files. So on the actual L drive, the virtual machines that you start off with are under subject files. At the diploma 6 DAS, and you need this, and you need a whole bunch of other files as well. Okay, it looks like I've got it here. So IT studies is where you'll see the IT studies NAS, obviously. And again, every step is a little bit slow. Okay, so it's a bit slow. I might check back in a little bit later. But right now, let's actually look at the worksheet. So you can see there's a whole heap of files you need. So like I said, pre-download all of these, because you're not going to have a good time if you actually are ready to go with doing this worksheet and then you click download, because you'll be waiting quite a bit before you can get started. So it's going to take 90 to 120 minutes, and obviously that's dependent also on your hardware. We spoke about that last week, how the more memory, the more CPU cores you've got, the better it's going to perform. So if you have less, then you will perform worse. So this picture might be very familiar with you, because this is basically what we built up in the previous subject, which is that enterprise virtualization subject. So we had our vCenter, we had our domain controller, we have our ESXi1, ESXi2, and TrueNAS as our shared storage server. But today, what we're going to do in this worksheet is we're going to add Horizon connection server. Okay, it's going to be those details, but the procedure is as follows. You can see that's 31 pages of procedures, and that's what I was talking about earlier, how it's going to take a long time to get through this worksheet. Okay, so that's why I split it up in building the lab environment. I split it up into 2 parts. Part 1 this week, part 2 next week, and obviously, like I said, we need this to be finished before you can do part 2. And the way the virtual machine is going to work for this subject is we're constantly building on top of it. So we need to sort of take our snapshots along the way. So at the end, it talks about taking a snapshot. But we'll continue. We'll install the server today, and we'll do some prerequisite stuff like the Active Directory and SQL Express. But next week, next worksheet, we'll basically finish it off. Let's get into our topic. Today, we're looking at building the Horizon environment. Our objective today is to understand, install, and configure the prerequisites for VMware Horizon, and install and configure Horizon suite of services. Okay, like I said, probably in our workshop, we're going to do the first part, install and configure the prerequisites of Horizon, install the Horizon server itself, but not do any configuration just yet. except for the SQL Express and stuff like that, but not the Horizon itself. But in the next worksheet, we'll install and configure the Horizon suite of services, and we're going to limit ourselves just to the core ones we need to get our environment working. Otherwise, like I said, with the resource requirements of the infrastructure we're building, our one computer, and I can't assume a student that's not at TAFE will have access to more than one computer. So basically, based on that one computer with the recommended hardware, there's only so much we can do. Okay, so in real life, there's going to be a lot more complications involving the cloud, involving internet connections and so forth. But we're going to limit ourselves to a basic bare minimum deployment of it because of resources as well as the timing of this unit. We also will be trying to understand the options during the installation process. Okay, so we're going to talk through it. So some of the prerequisites. Okay, so basically, first of all, our VMware vSphere environment from our previous subject, you would have remembered that we integrated that with Active Directory. We were able to secure it using Active Directory users and groups, and then combining those with our vSphere roles, and then permissions or privileges. And we're going to do that again in this subject, okay? Because we're still using that vSphere. We're still integrating with Active Directory. We're going to be integrating Active Directory more so even. So we need service accounts in Active Directory for the connection server. So the connection server is the main thing for Horizon. And this connection server is for logging on to the Horizon Administrator console. Obviously, we need to have a way of logging into the console and doing our administration work, and that's the account. And also, it's used by the Horizon. We need Active Directory users, and also another account that's used by Horizon Connection Server to manage components of vCenter. So Horizon is a separate thing to vCenter and vSphere, but it needs to interact with vCenter and vSphere in order to virtualize the virtual desktops. So therefore, we need to create a user account in Active Directory, which will use that methodology of assigning roles and privileges to give this account access to the vCenter and to make modifications. And we'll look at some of the permissions a little bit later on in the next couple of slides. We'll need another account that's for creating link clones and instant clones, because they will become Active Directory computer accounts. Yeah, so don't forget, these virtual machines are still going to be in our Active Directory. They're still going to be able to allow the users to log in with their AD or Active Directory accounts, and we're still going to be using group policies to configure them, and we'll be using their permissions to access resources from these workstations. We need an organizational unit for Horizon desktops. Okay, so as we know, these Horizon desktops are not permanent. They're disposable. So we don't want a messy AD full of desktop computers and making it hard for us to understand which ones are real desktops, which ones are virtualized desktops, which ones are disposable, which ones are permanent. So we use an OU, organizational unit, for Horizon desktops in order to organize these virtualized desktops in Active Directory. We will need an SQL server with an events database created for Horizon events. So what does that mean? So basically, it's a logs. Okay, so every service in the world, including your Windows Active Directory, including DNS, including DHCP, including Horizon, needs to have logs. Logs are a way of investigating what's happening on your server, and if there's problems, it's a way of investigating what has happened to cause the problems. So Horizon is highly dependent on a database for the logging of its events. So it says SQL Server, but SQL Server again is a licensed software, and obviously in a production environment, yes, you would pay for that licensing. Yes, you would pay for that licensing, install it on a different physical machine or different virtual machine, and have that running and have the events being logged to the SQL Server through the network. Again, in our worksheet, in our lab, we're going to keep the SQL server on the same machine as the Horizon server itself. Not ideal, not recommended, not best practice. But to minimize resource requirements for another server, we've done that. Okay, make sure you understand that. Make sure you understand that it is not best practice, is not what I'm telling you to do. It's how we're going to learn about these things in this lab environment. In production, definitely not. In fact, we're not even going to use SQL Server, the full SQL Server that is, Microsoft SQL Server. We're going to use Microsoft SQL Express. Express is a free version of SQL Server, but it's limited in the size of the CPU, memory, and so forth. So it's fine for small testing environments like what we're using this lab for, but it's no good for the production environment. So for the production environment, you will have to fork out money for the full licensing of Microsoft SQL Server. But having said that, it doesn't have to be Microsoft SQL Server. It just has to be an SQL compatible server. It could be Oracle, it could be something else. Remember we talked about permissions, okay? So that account, that vCenter, Horizon vCenter account, remember that account we needed in Active Directory that's for interacting with vCenter? It needs these kind of permissions, okay? So what does that mean? So basically this is in vCenter, we configure these a role and we set it these privileges. For folders, it needs to be able to create folders, delete folders. For the data store, allocate space, browse the data store, low-level file operations. For virtual machines, we need to do everything for configuration, everything for the inventory, everything for snapshot management and interaction. We need to do pretty much everything. This is the minimum, but we are in our worksheet we've put everything just so that we can we don't have any problems with it. With the provisioning, we need to be able to customize, deploy templates, read the customization specification, clone virtual machines, and allow disk access. As you suspect, provisioning is making of virtual machines. Oops, sorry, I ticked over. I was trying to scroll down. So as far as resources, we need virtual machine. We need to be able to assign virtual machines to resource pools, migrate power off virtual machines, and for global, which is everything, act as a vCenter server, enable methods, disable methods, and do system tags. For the host, which is the ESXi host, for the networking, we need to be able to do all of it. And for the configuration, we need to look at the advanced settings. So all of this is very confusing, but it sort of it will make sense when we do the worksheet because we walk you through the various parts. So if we look at the worksheet that's relevant to that, so obviously we create those organizational units and we configure vCenter to join the domain and to basically use Active Directory as our identity provider, like we did in the previous subject. And then we create a new role. We select the different things. So if we talk about folder, okay. So if we're talking about folder, we select folder and then we tick to give the permissions, and then data store we tick, allocate disk spaces, and so forth. So it makes sense when we're actually doing it. When you see it on this table, it seems a little bit overwhelming, but as we're doing it, working through the worksheet, it tells you what to tick. What about for the Horizon connection server itself? If you remember last week, we said that the Horizon connection server is actually installed on top of a Windows server, which is a member of the Active Directory domain. So that's the same. So we need a minimum of 4 CPUs, 10 gigs of memory, 1 gigabit per second network card, which is normal, 60 gigs of free space, and the OS would be a Windows server, which is a member of the Active Directory domain. So what we're going to do again in our worksheet is we're going to take our server 1, and it's got a where is it? We'll go down. We'll go down. Sorry. As you can see, so we're going to take the server 1 base, which is basically just when the server is installed, and we're going to make a link clone. So everyone should be familiar with this idea of a link clone and the reasons why we use a link clone, which is to save space and save time and effort. And we're going to make sure we create a link clone. We're going to then adjust the virtual hardware to meet these requirements. Importantly, we need to make sure, because it's a clone, we need to make sure that it is got a different SID. So if you remember back into your Cert 4 days, we used a program called SysPrep to prepare the system for cloning. So basically, after we make the clone, because we don't have a golden master in this case, we're going to run SysPrep. Then we're going to change the computer name, configure the IP addressing and so forth, and join into the domain. And at that time, we can actually start preparing it to become the connection server. So my initial task for after installation is to sign into the Horizon connection console, add the licensing, add the vCenter server for the desktop management. Obviously, that's what we're relying on. The licensing is all important. So VMware wants their money, basically. You can't use this without license. What we're going to try to do is use a trial license. And what we're going to hopefully do is have enough time in that trial license to be able to finish this course. So instant clone domain. So part of when we start provisioning the virtual desktops, we will be creating what's called instant clones. I think I mentioned that last week. So we need to configure the domain account for instant clones. So this Active Directory account will need to have the create computer objects, delete computer objects, and write all properties permissions within AD. So that's delegation of Active Directory permissions. So this is a little bit new to us, but we've spoken about it, especially if you studied networking with me. We talked about how there's permissions in all sorts of things. We mainly learned file system permissions, but you would have learned printer permissions, but there's also Active Directory permissions itself, meaning we can give other users or groups permissions to do certain actions inside of Active Directory. And we'll be using the Active Directory delegation to do this. Okay, and again, we'll walk you through it. So no need to stress right now, but they need the list permissions and all these other permissions. As you suspect, because we're going to use this account, we don't want to use the administrator account for every task, but we're going to use this special account we create with the right permissions to create new computer objects, delete computer objects, and do all those things as we're creating these instant clones or disposable virtualized workstations. So like we mentioned, the Horizon events database is used to store the events of the that Horizon generates. The database can be either Microsoft SQL database or Oracle database and needs to be configured beforehand. Okay, so that's one of our major tasks in this first worksheet, is to actually configure SQL Express. Okay, so that's the basic configuration. We're also going to disable the firewalls just so that's not a problem that's going to confuse us. So we'll keep that as out of the picture. So we're going to add some Windows components that we need beforehand, and that's the .NET frameworks. But then we will be we'll be accessing the Microsoft SQL Server. We're going to install the Microsoft SQL Express, and we're going to do some configuration of that. And then we're going to install the Microsoft Server Management Studios, and we're going to create a new database, and we're going to create, configure the IP, the TCP IP, which is what you require if the computer is on if the database is on a separate computer, because your Horizon connection server is going to send its events or logs to this database server through the network. So we need to enable TCP IP. So you can see that is quite a bit of this worksheet. We're already up to page 25 of 31, just getting the prerequisites done. So that's why it's going to take us a long time to do this one. So basically, when using SQL Server for Horizon Events database, it only supports SQL Server authentication mode. Horizon administrators, we can configure the Horizon administrator by adding the AD account mentioned earlier as the Horizon administrator. So we'll delegate permissions again. Some general settings. So the general settings are a group of settings that define how defines the options, including the SSO configuration and how end users log in. So for example, there's Horizon console session timeout. As the name suggests, how long does it wait before the console basically assumes you're gone and locks itself again. API session timeout. APIs, if you remember, are application program interfaces. So again, we can integrate third-party programs or your own programs to connect to the connection server and administer things. But if the API is taking too long to respond, how long does it wait? Again, forcibly disconnect users. We'll disconnect all users once the specified time has elapsed since the end user logged in. So again, just a way of kicking people off if they're taking too long, because obviously they might have walked off and you don't want to keep that connection alive. And also it's for security. Single sign-on, you probably heard that before. True single sign-on means that when end users log in using another form of authentication other than AD credentials, true single sign-on generates a short-term certificate rather than using a cache credentials after the user logs on. There's the discard single sign-on credentials, so which this means that we'll discard that automatically, so forcing them to re-log in, re-authenticate. So this is when the users are idle. Okay, again for security. Display a pre-login message, and as the name suggests, it's a message is displayed when the user connects before they log in. This message could be a warning or disclaimer that if you're not accessing the system, you need to be authorized and so forth. We've seen that before, like in the Cisco login banner and so forth. Display warning before forced log off. So basically, we might want to log people off, but this warning message will pop up for them before they're logged off. Enables Windows Server desktops. This allows servers to be used as a desktop machine, so that we'll now display server as well as desktops. Clean up credentials when tab is closed for HTML access. So as you remember, we spoke about how you can access the connection server through HTML as well. So, but if you've saved your credentials on the HTML, this cleanup is used to remove the end user's credentials from the cache when they close the tab, so that they're using to connect. Okay, so obviously again for security, so that someone can't just sit on your computer and reconnect. The next one is hide server information in client user interface, and this one is to so as the name suggests, Horizon server address is not shown. Okay, obviously for security, before you can log in, if you can know where the server is, there's a chance you can get information out of that and attack the server. Okay, so next one is hide domain list in client interface. Again, if you can see which domains, it gives someone who hasn't logged in lots of information about your domain. And the send domain list is all about allows the connection server to send a list of user domain names to the client before the user authenticates. So this is the opposite of that. And this last one is to enable multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication. Next server we're going to talk about is a Horizon replica server. So the Horizon replica server essentially is the same as the Horizon connection server. It's a replica. So we talked about how it's the importance of the replica last week. So if you remember, the connection server is how users what they use to connect to their virtual desktop or generate the virtual desktops. If it's not available, obviously no one can get a desktop that they can use. So basically, this replica server is another connection server, and it replicates exactly what's on the connection server. You'll see during our connection server installation, there's an option to select replica. And basically you can do the same installation method, but select the replica server instead, in which will ask you a few questions about the connection server, and then go forth and do that. There's a Horizon enrollment server, so the host prerequisites are pretty much the same. Again, it's on a Windows server, which is part of the member of the Active Directory. The enrollment server is the server that enrolls users into this with a certificate. Okay, so obviously we use certificates for security and for trust, and in order to actually have a secure connection. The Unified Access Gateway, this is a very important server. Okay, this server is meant for internet accessible clients. What does that mean? Remember last week we talked about how you don't have to be on the on location, on site, to be able to use your desktops. Obviously, we talked about how if you're on the road, if you're overseas, you're at home, and you've got an internet connection. Okay, if you've got an internet connection, that means you can connect to the Unified Access Gateway, which is going to then allow you to connect to the connection server and then get yourself a virtual desktop and run it from anywhere. We talked about how that's important because it's even though you're on a remote site, your actual virtual machine is running on your company site. The data you are accessing is stored on your company site, and the interactions you're having is sent from inside your company site to another service. So even if the device you're using, the physical device you're using, is compromised or stolen, none of that data exists on that device. So the UAG, or Unified Access Gateway, is a pre-built virtual appliance, a bit like our vCenter server, if you remember when we deployed it from a OVA. Okay, it's a virtual appliance that's installed on your vSphere infrastructure, so it becomes a virtual machine, and then configured to your deployment once that appliance has been deployed. The UAG is available in different sizes, depending on the number of end users you want to support. So obviously, the higher amount of end users would result in a higher demanding UAG as far as resources goes. Yeah, so deploying the Unified Access Gateway, you deploy the Unified Access Gateway on the vSphere infrastructure. Before you do this, ensure you have downloaded the UAG OVF template. Okay, so the template is basically a virtual machine that's been converted into a template, and from this you can actually deploy a new virtual machine as a template. It's a bit like cloning, if you think about it. So if you remember, we talked about templates in the previous subject. Instead of actually cloning a virtual machine, you're cloning this template. So deploying the Cloud Pod Architecture, or CPA. Okay, this is where, what if you have multiple sites? What if you have multiple sites for the same organization? So you can use two connection servers that are different locations. You can link multiple pods, which is what we call these sites, to create a single desktop and browsing environment called a pod federation. A pod federation can span multiple sites and data centers, and you can join them, joining the connection servers to a pod federation. So it basically means that, hey, if you're on different sites, you can travel between sites, and you can use same credentials, same logins, and deploy virtual machines at either site. And obviously with the UAG, that means you can actually access it from online outside of the sites and still be able to deploy the virtual machines into that infrastructure, perhaps at either of the sites, multiple sites. For the purpose of our course, we're not going to do this, okay? We're not going to do this. We're going to keep it simple. We're going to keep it to a single site, and we're going to only deploy to that site. So like I said, it's going to be a quick presentation with just the essentials. Hopefully we'll cover that. And obviously, right now we want to work through worksheet 1, which is building the lab environment. But don't forget, it's just part 1 of 2.